Sophie, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. So good afternoon, bonjour, pronam dar, as we say in Wales. What I want to share with you today is an overview of the Welsh approach to, I suppose, three elements which are pressing policy frameworks for the world at the moment. So the shift to measuring well-being rather than just measuring economic growth, a focus on how do we at a local level or a national level implement the Sustainable Development Goals, and how do we account for the interests of future generations. And Wales was the first country in the world to pass legislation which does all of these things. So putting on a statutory footing these concepts around well-being, legislating for the SDGs, and putting a specific requirement on 44 of our main public institutions to demonstrate how, when they're taking decisions, they're meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So Wales's history or story or journey, whatever you want to call it, with sustainable development goes back a long way. In the Government of Wales Act, which established the Welsh Government and Parliament in 1999, there was a clause which said sustainable development should be a central organising principle. In reality, that didn't mean an awful lot, and it was seen as the responsibility of the Environment Minister to report on sustainability. There was a frustration from that Environment Minister that was the case, and actually, the Housing Minister, the Economy Minister, the Transport Minister, what they were doing were actually the most critical things in terms of ensuring sustainable development, but they weren't really on board. And she managed to get a commitment that Wales would legislate, therefore, for sustainable development. The first thing that happened following that commitment was the government organised a national conversation with the citizens of Wales called the Wales We Want, and the question posed is, what is the Wales that you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? And the people of Wales, over 10,000 people were engaged in that conversation, and the people of Wales came up with a set of principles that they felt was important in terms of the Wales that they wanted to leave behind. At the same time, the UN SDGs were in development. So the government looked to the international policy landscape through the SDGs, looked at what the people of Wales were saying, and took the 17 SDGs with the views of the people of Wales down into 7 long-term wellbeing goals, which you can see here in this inner circle. Now, just looking at them, a prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, a healthier Wales, there's nothing there that you could, that is particularly exciting in terms of those headlines, or that you could particularly disagree with. But actually, when we get into the statutory definitions which sit beneath those headlines, the goal of a prosperous Wales, the statutory definition is a productive, innovative, low carbon society, one which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, and one which develops a well-educated population with the skills to enable them to access decent work. You might be noting the emission from that. It's a purposeful emission, an emission of prosperity being about GDP. And you might also note that our definition of prosperity sits very much within planetary boundaries. I won't go into the definitions of all of the other 6 wellbeing goals, but they are very much focused on how do we ensure that we are preventing problems from occurring. So, for example, that people's physical and mental health and well-being is maximised in order to prevent illness. And all of the goals here are really focused on that kind of long-term aspiration for Wales. So the legal requirements on 48 public bodies. There have just been, it started with 44, and there are some new ones added, and additional ones to come this year as well. The legal requirements on them, and sorry, they cover all of our local authorities, our local councils, they cover all of our health institutions, our national agencies like Public Health Wales, Natural Resources Wales, our Arts Council, and then significantly the Welsh Government itself and Welsh ministers themselves are named in the Act, they have to demonstrate how, when they're taking decisions, they are meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. They have to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of those wellbeing goals. And an important part to note there is that all of those institutions are required to maximise contribution to all of those goals. So this is really looking around the wellbeing contribution that every institution can make. So if you're a health board, you might think, well, traditionally our job is to, to treat people when they're ill. Actually, if the healthcare sector was a country, it would be the 5th biggest emitter of carbon in the world, and one of the biggest threats to human health is planetary health, and therefore absolutely it is right that the healthcare system itself is aiming to decarbonise at pace. So it's really pushing these organisations to not only think to the long term and to the interests of future generations, but to work in an integrated way beyond their boundaries. And speaking to that integration, the Act also sets out 5 ways of working, so that public institutions must demonstrate how, when they're taking decision, they've considered the long-term impact of the things that they do, how they are seeking to prevent problems from occurring or getting worse. And, we all know the challenges of putting a sticking plaster and the high cost of putting a sticking plaster on things without ever really getting to addressing the root cause of things. They must collaborate with each other. They must involve citizens in the decision-making process. And again, it's worth noting there that that term is involvement, not engagement or consultation. It's a much deeper sense of co-production of solutions. And then they must integrate their thinking. And we know from a wellbeing perspective that is absolutely crucial. If we look, for example, at what the World Health Organization tell us are the major factors in the differences in life inequality, life expectancy and health inequality. Where I live in Cardiff, I've got every chance of living 20 years longer than someone who lives in the south of Cardiff, just 5 or 6 miles away from me. And for too long, we have focused on a model of just treating illness rather than looking at the wider determinants of health. And the World Health Organization tell us that 35% of what makes a difference to that gap in life expectancy is about income security, so essentially about poverty. 29% is about our living conditions. So do we live in areas of high air pollution? What's the quality of our housing? Can we access sort of public open space and nature? 19% is about social and human capital. So the quality of your relationships. Do you have people you can turn to in your hour of need? Do you feel that there's a sense of community and you have agency in that community? And then only 10% is about the healthcare system itself. So we can see why that point around integration is so critically important, and we can see why perhaps historically we focused on a goal of a healthier Wales. We'll give that to the national health system to deal with, actually, they don't hold those levers for actually keeping people well, addressing health inequality and the differences in life expectancy are in these other areas. They relate to these other wellbeing goals and these other organisations. So here's just the kind of architecture of the Act. We've got the 7 wellbeing goals there. That they are supported by 50 national indicators that track the progress of Wales as a nation across those wellbeing goals. They're not a perfect set of indicators. Not everything we would want to measure we've been able to measure, but they do also include qualitative data through a national survey of citizens in Wales, where we look at some of those softer measures. Is there a sense of community in your area? Do you feel lonely and isolated, and so on. They also the government also sets milestones. This is what they want to achieve through the legislation at particular points. And they also produce a future trends report. So for use by all of the public bodies, identifying the key future trends facing Wales. The Act then applies, as I said, to the 50 individual public bodies, and they also established something called public services boards. So these are statutory boards which are a collection of all of the key public services in each local authority area, and some of them have regionalised. They have duties to do a wellbeing assessment of their area, so to look at the wellbeing issues across those 7 wellbeing goals currently and how they might play out into the future. So using future trends and scenarios and foresighting, and then to set a collective wellbeing plan to address those. So again, this is recognising that no one organisation can solve some of these big future challenges on their own. Then enabling the change and providing the accountability framework for the change, myself as the Future Generations Commissioner, and also the Auditor General for Wales. So the Future Generations Act...
Sophie,
yes?
Sorry to interrupt. We are still seeing the slide, our goals and our ways of... Is that...
Right.
Okay.
Oh, are you seeing anything change now?
No, and we're seeing your not the presenter view.
Okay.
Oh, I see your mouse moving though.
Ah, okay. Let me stop sharing and see if I can get it back up. I'm sorry about this, everyone. I'll carry on talking. Bear with me a second. Are you seeing my slides now? You should be seeing the Wellbeing for Future Generations Act architecture.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
It's not in full screen, but we see it well.
Okay, let's get onto the slideshow then. Current slide. Okay, hopefully you're seeing this. So my role as the future...
So that may be where it's gone wrong, because the slideshow did not... we're still seeing the same screen as before you press slideshow.
Okay, so are you now seeing it without the slideshow view?
Yes,
yeah, I'll just leave it on this then, so that we
just try changing slides back and forth to make sure that is working. Okay, very good.
Yeah, great. Okay, don't know what's going on there. My role as the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. So I've been described by the Guardian newspaper as the world's first minister for the unborn. That's not strictly accurate. I'm not a minister. I am independent of government, and my job is to hold the government and the other institutions to account on how they're delivering the requirements of the Future Generations Act, but also to provide advice and support to them. So we do that through a range of tools, through a focus on the kind of leadership competencies that we need to see in order to implement the Future Generations Act. A lot of rolling our hands up and really getting alongside public institutions and the officials working in them to try and challenge their thinking. A lot of what we do are connecting sometimes this civil service department to that civil service department, sometimes this civil service department to these to this NGO who can help them to think more holistically and to the long term. The crunchiest ends of my powers, if you like, are what are called Section 20 review powers. So there I can go into an institution or a collection of bodies and review things the approaches that they might be taking, and I can make statutory recommendations which they have duties to publicly respond to. I can't force anyone to do anything or stop anyone doing anything, but there is certainly a power in having an independent commissioner calling out on behalf of the Future Generations Act. So what is changing? Well, first of all, the Future Generations Commissioner every 5 years has to publish a Future Generations report. The first one I published in 2020 to give you, and the reason that it lands at that time is that it lands a year before the next parliamentary elections, and it's supposed to influence manifestos. We are now seeing around about 56% of the recommendations that I made featured in the programme for government, so we can see the impact there. Just a few other headlines of things that are changing. I think that there was a kind of fairly slow start, and you know, those of you interested in the real sort of detail of how you make these things work in government, that's because when you come up with a kind of framework, a bureaucratic system, and you know, a lot of our systems are very bureaucratic, the easy thing to do is to focus on doing a wellbeing assessment and writing a plan and saying the right words in all of your documents, but not actually changing anything that you do. So this has been a huge cultural change program where we really needed to get in to support those people who are trying to bring change about, to challenge those who are not moving quick enough. And there's a really fine sort of, you know, balance there between support and constructive challenge. So some of the things that we're seeing in terms of progress: Wales is now number 3 in the world for household recycling, and as a result of the Future Generations Act, we've set a holistic policy to become a zero waste nation by 2050. And why I say holistic is because that zero waste policy is focusing on things like, how do you deliver zero waste whilst also promoting community cohesion and addressing inequality? We know the kind of long-term benefits in terms of to well-being around addressing those issues. So things like the setting up and funding the library of things so that communities share things like lawnmowers and other items, introducing free repair cafes so you can go along and get your mobile phone or your washing machine or whatever it might be repaired, whilst also engaging with your community, introducing school uniform swap shops to take that school uniform out of the kind of you know, going into landfill, but also addressing socioeconomic disadvantage and the cost of school uniform for those people who are living in poverty. So some really important kind of connections there. Transport is probably the best example of a full shift in terms, I'm just going to move to the next slide, a full shift in the whole approach to well-being. And the first sort of big test of the Future Generations Act and the role of the Commissioner was an intervention that I made in the government's plans to spend the entire of the Welsh Government borrowing capacity in building a 13-mile stretch of motorway at the M4 to deal with the problem of congestion. And I asked the government to explain to me there how they'd applied a future generations and wellbeing lens to that decision. I asked them to explain to me how it was in line with our wellbeing goal of a prosperous Wales, which commits us to our climate and carbon reduction targets. I asked them to explain to me how it was in line with our goal of a resilient Wales, which talks about ecological resilience and enhancing and maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. The road would have gone through the site of special scientific interest. I asked them to explain to me how they'd applied the goal of a more equal Wales when 25% of the lowest income families in that area don't have access to a car. I'd asked them to explain to me how they'd applied the goal of a healthier Wales when we have illegal levels of air pollution and we have increasing rates of adult and childhood obesity. So we need to have that modal shift in order to help address some of those issues. Cut a long story short, but the road was considered to be a done deal, but following those interventions, the First Minister changed his mind and cancelled that road building scheme because it did not align with the Future Generations Act. Since then, we've seen a moratorium on all road building in Wales, with 55 pre-approved schemes cancelled, all now being assessed through wellbeing metrics. We've seen a new transport strategy for Wales based around our 7 wellbeing goals. In last year's budget, we saw a reduction in spending from 2/3 of our infrastructure investment budget to 1/3 on building roads. All residential roads now in Wales have been reduced to 20 miles an hour, and that investment, that saving of the 2/3 to 1/3, is now being invested in active travel, because that is a much better solution to meeting our long-term goals. I know I'm very short of time, so just very, very quickly, the Future Generations Act and the Wellbeing Goals has driven reforms to our school curriculum. So the pillars of our school curriculum are now based around One, identifying what those key skills for the future will be, but key skills not just to go into a job of the future, but actually to have a life well lived. So a very big focus on the physical, mental health and well-being of our pupils and students, with the aim of the curriculum being for schools to develop healthy, active and confident learners. A focus on developing creative and enterprising citizens, and you can see back perhaps to one of our goals, which is unusual in sustainability arena, around culture, language, heritage, but that's critically important. And then also an outcome from the curriculum, which teachers must help to deliver, is to develop ethical and informed global citizens. Now, if we had had a curriculum like that, perhaps 20 years ago or much longer when I was in school, perhaps the learning, the values, the understanding of the broader world that we live in, of those people who come through that education system, perhaps that would mean we weren't facing the climate catastrophe and a range of other issues as well. Very, very finally, a big focus around tackling poverty. So some of the work that I've been doing and pressing for a universal basic income, and showing modelling of how, if we spent on tackling poverty through a universal basic income, that would have long-term significant benefits to the well-being of people in Wales. That was seen as a policy initiative that was not even on the agenda even as far as 3 years ago. And this year in Wales, the government progressing a pilot of a basic income focused on those young people leaving the care system initially, who are of course the most disadvantaged in many of our global north societies. So those young people will get £1,600 a year with for 2 years, with a big evaluation wrapped around that, and that is really designed to look at the long-term impact of addressing poverty and the long-term impact that putting that money back into people's pockets can have on each one of our 7 well-being goals. So lots of progress made. In the Q&A, I'm sure you'll want the warts and all version, which is none of this is easy. Frameworks aren't the answer. They might help, but it's cultural change that is really pressing. But having a piece of legislation is really important to give that overarching framework for an entire nation, in the case of Wales, to get behind a set of long-term goals, which shift us away from an obsession with growth at any cost towards us prioritising the well-being of people and of planet. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sophie. I think I can speak on behalf of everybody in Canada who is working on this topic in any way that was inspiring and a little overwhelming, even at in how far you've progressed. So let me now turn towards the Canadian situation, and we have a few people to tell us about bits of that. First of all, I would like to ask Stephanie Gann, who is the Director of Frameworks Integration at the Treasury Board Secretariat in our federal government, and I'm going to let her explain why how that is, why the Treasury Board, I suppose, and a little bit of the history of how we got there for the Canadian federal efforts, and then we'll talk about. I have a ton of questions to ask Sophie, but we're going to go through our Canadian speakers first. Stephanie, take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Chris. Hopefully you can hear me all right. Excellent. So off the bat, I should apologize to Sophie, in that my team and I had the pleasure of meeting her yesterday. So there will be a little bit of a recap that will seem familiar, Sophie, but just to lay the groundwork for our discussion, please bear with us. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to share the experience of the Treasury Board Secretariat with quality of life. It is that Treasury Board Secretariat, TBS, is the current lead Canadian federal government department with respect to implementation of the Canadian Quality of Life Framework. Before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge that since I'm joining this webinar from Ottawa, I am on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin people have lived on this land since time immemorial, and I'm grateful to be present on this territory. Later in this discussion, we will be joined by my colleague from the Department of Environment and Climate Change, Vincent Klassen. He and his team are lead in the federal government on the tremendous feat that is known as the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. That he is here speaks to how on quality of life and sustainable development in the Canadian system has both top-down and bottom-up approaches being applied, as will come up again in my remarks. I was going to hone in on some of the highlights of working on quality of life from the TBS perspective, but perhaps I should back up and start with the quality of life framework itself in Canada, or rather the Canadian quality of life framework. It grew out of a growing momentum that perhaps many around the table are quite familiar with, both domestically and internationally. And it is an effort to look beyond GDP, measures of goods and services in an economy, as a standalone measure of the overall well-being of societies. There are simply too many elements, including the distribution of resources, non-economic, non-market activities, externalities, natural assets. These are all factors that contribute to well-being and the well-being of individuals living in societies. And these are in notable ways excluded from the traditional macroeconomic metrics. And also the dependence on these metrics then do not make certain policy trade-offs explicit. It was in this context that under the leadership of the Department of Finance, a Canadian Quality of Life framework was introduced in 2021 and applied to budgets of that year and in 2022. Under finance, the framework was the culmination of extensive consultations with leading experts in economics on the environment, on well-being. There were discussions with willing provincial and territorial governments and stakeholders, with the 3 national Indigenous organizations, and there was also public opinion research conducted on the subject. Where did we arrive at? It is through 84 indicators that the Canadian Quality of Life framework aims to depict in an enduring way the various dimensions of Canadians' well-being. These indicators are organized across 5 main domains: prosperity, society, environment, health, and good governance. Also, by implication, then, these are ways in which the government can have an impact on the quality of life of Canadians. The framework has 2 cross-cutting lenses. The first is a fairness and inclusion lens, which recognizes that the quality, or rather that quality of life and the impact of government policy and programming can differ for Canadians based on factors and combinations of factors like age, disability, whether they are Indigenous, level of education, language, sexual orientation, and so on. Across the framework, there is also a sustainability and resilience lens, which recognizes the need for long-term thinking and the trajectory of quality of life indicators, not simply where they are today. The use of the lens, of this particular lens, is supposed to prompt the consideration systematically of a long-term perspective and of risk and resilience across domains, implicating such concepts as human capital, social capital, fiscal sustainability, and intergenerational equity. This perspective is probably the most advanced in the federal government's sustainable development work, where environmental, climate, questions of resilience have been a very key focus. Since the federal government's 2021 budget, TBS has taken the overall lead on quality of life implementation. Sorry, there are no slides. They're just verbal remarks. I apologize for that. Just to answer the question from the chat. TBS is currently still undertaking consultations and engaging across government and outside to develop options for setting up the foundation for fuller implementation of the quality of life framework beyond budgeting. But I think there are a few highlights that at this point in our process, I would like to note as having stood out. Firstly, the quality of life framework came about because something was missing, something that brought together the multiple dimensions of the quality of life Canadians was notable by omission, and there was a demand for it from multiple corners. And even while there are holdouts to a well-being approach to policy, there is recognition that the processes and requirements supporting policymaking today have gotten too burdensome with the accretion of frameworks, lenses, policy tools, all to make sense of policy complexity. The vision from our perspective is perhaps to go beyond mainstreaming, simply mainstreaming the concept of well-being, but offer a reference point and an umbrella organizing framework to understand and make sense of government initiatives in different areas that have developed in a bottom-up way. Our work on the framework offers an opportunity to better represent how these areas relate and how they could be developed, coordinated, implemented, and reported on to achieve outcomes that matter to Canadians. And we are trying to engage in these discussions to figure out what that could look like going ahead. Another highlight is this work puts TBS squarely in the domain of change management. One reason why TBS was assigned this responsibility for implementation from our perspective is that it supports the Treasury Board, the federal government's management board, providing oversight of the government's financial management and spending, and also responsible for certain kinds of reporting to Parliament. This means then that TBS has a number of tools to be able to establish expected outcomes, management practices, and reporting requirements for the departmental community. We're aiming for quality of life not to be a checkbox exercise, but to enable the integration of these concepts into government operations as a matter of practice in support of evidence-based policymaking. And we will see how our tools are able to do this. Lastly, I would note that in order to have a basis to influence decision-making, the frame is essential, helpful, but it must be supported by an evidence base. And a crucial area of our work on the file is our partnership with Statistics Canada and the Department of Finance to develop a quality of life evidence base and data, and to fill in gaps where they exist, to build literacy around this evidence base and to socialize its usage. The Statistics Canada Quality of Life Hub, launched in March of this year, is a starting point. The two cross-cutting lenses of the quality of life framework require data collection and methods that the current policy cycle should be integrating more thoroughly. There have been significant investments by the Canadian government in our statistical agency in disaggregated data for Indigenous distinctions-based strategies and a census of the environment, all towards similar ends, but this will be a work in progress. However, this transition could seem to be essential if we are serious about evidence-based policy. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Chris.
Stephanie, thank you so much for giving us some history and an update on the federal government initiative. I'd now like to turn to one of our provinces. We're going to hear from a province and a territory today. And so Danny Graham, who is the CEO of Engage Nova Scotia, and the CEO stands for Chief Engagement Officer. And this is a organization, as you'll hear, that is really leading the way in Canada, along with the federal government, in implementing something akin to what we've heard about from Wales. Danny, I see your lovely presentation, but not yet your camera. If you want to turn that back on. Super, take it away.
That, okay, thanks very much.
And I hear you well.
And great, thank you, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation. Congratulations for all the work that you've been doing in Wales, Sophie, and for the rest of your team. Thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about what's happening in Mi'kma'ki. I'm coming to you from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Chibuktuk, and we're really excited about the way that quality of life and well-being are being animated across a bunch of sectors in our province. We like to say at Engage Nova Scotia that we sit at the intersection of the public, private, academic, and community sectors. And from this logo soup, with apologies, across sectors and geographies and governments, we're trying as best we can to provide insights and tools about how a quality of life framework would advance us. Special shout out to the province of Nova Scotia and the Nova Scotia Community College for their support in the efforts that we put together to advance, first in collaboration with the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, a survey that was conducted in 2019, where 1 in 5 households in our province were given the opportunity to participate in a 230-question survey. Some in the federal government have described it as much as a census as it was a survey, given the breadth and depth of the responses that we've gotten from this. And it's created for us this large single quality of life data set that's actually consistent in frame with what Stephanie was just describing to be the federal initiative. So we got 13,000 responses to those 230 questions for individuals aged 16 and older. And it gives us a high reliability on margin of error with a plan to resurvey in 2024. Given that there's only limited time to speak about this, I'm going to take you very quickly to the broad strokes of what's contained in the work that we're doing. First of all, with respect to the what's possible, demographically across these black bars at the top, you'll see that there's a tremendous, this is just a sampling of the kinds of ways that we can break down the demographic profile of what's happening inside of that. And then inside of it, the Canadian Index of Wellbeing domains are described in the material that you've seen below that. Many of them you would be familiar with and are consistent with what Stephanie was just saying about what's happening at the federal level. I'm going to focus just on a couple of those issues in a moment, but I just want to describe for you in general how we are framing this up. First of all, there are reports that we've created, hundreds of pages that obviously make us quite excited about being able to produce lots of bars and graphs. But it was the collaboration that we created with Dalhousie in building tools that really helped us create what we think is a bit of a breakthrough in terms of making the understanding of the lived life and circumstances, perceptions, and so on of Nova Scotians available to people. So 3 tools that have been created with Dalhousie. One we're calling the Spotlight tool. I'll just touch on that briefly. Actually, I'm not even going to touch on that one because time doesn't allow us to give you an opportunity to look at that. I am going to show you very briefly this well-being mapping tool. Again, thank you, Dalhousie, for the Faculty of Computer Sciences to help us make that a possibility. And then most recently, and even for those on the line who have been part of the presentations that we've done, this is a new tool that we've created with Dalhousie that we're calling the Wellbeing Analysis tool. Ultimately, the goal that we're focused on relates to this idea of informing the decisions about government and philanthropy and others, both by the priorities that exist already, but ultimately a deeper understanding of the evidence that sort of is connecting these opportunities all together. So again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to give you a very quick sampling of what those tools are. The first one that I have, this is live and on our website, by the way, is called our Wellbeing Mapping tool. And all of the questions from our survey are loaded into this particular tool. You can go there when you finish and just scrolling around our website, and you'll find out exactly what we're doing. You'll see those 8 domains that we talked about before. This particular map is special interest to our partners who are at the local and municipal levels of government, but also of interest to everyone. I'm just going to give you a small sample of how we're trying to make this accessible at a local level for everyone. So I've gone to the community vitality domain. I've just clicked on the sense of community scores. You'll see that there are a number of really interesting scores for those who are very focused on all things tied to social connections. And I noted, Sophie, when you talked about the 19% figure that shows up around sense of community and social connections, those figures show up for us as being really important, including the aggregation of those. But I'll just give you one sampling of this by map related to the sense of community that people in Nova Scotia are feeling. And you'll see right away that this is measured on a scale of 1 to 7. We've got postal codes all across the province that are being considered here, and an overall look at the picture for Nova Scotia that can be zoomed in. It gives us different experiences across different FSAs, postal code first 3 digits, that give us a feel for where people are on this particular question, showing a high sense of community. And we can group these forward sortation areas together and do analysis, again, at a local level that hasn't been possible for us for a long period of time. And if you're really curious about where everything is, we have map transparency and a bunch of other really fun and fancy things that give us this as an opportunity. So I'm not sure if I need to actually stop sharing and go back to this, because I'm just going to switch to another tool, again, all in the interest of time, that we have loaded onto our, loaded in here somewhere.
It's the next tab.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think that might have been Taylor, our research coordinator, giving me instructions. So here's a new tool. So what you just saw disaggregates based on questions of geography. All the questions are loaded. We can do tons of analysis at a geographic level, but we have a ton of other questions that also are in here. Life satisfaction, subjective well-being, obviously a really important one that gives us new information. But what we've been able to do is reduce the time. It used to take about 2 weeks to do analysis on any particular question and group, to something that actually takes us just a matter of a few minutes. Again, thanks to our partners for doing this. And I want to go to that belonging question all over again. You'll see how many we've already got loaded in here. And here's the belonging question. So same question, but this time we're taking a look at this across dimensions that are organized according to the concerns that show up in purple, all related to people with low belonging, and then with people with high belonging in here, that has many different features that we're happy to talk about at a later date, but also includes, just as a final point, the opportunity to actually generate text so that we're able to see within minutes the story of life satisfaction for people who self-report having a low sense of belonging to their community, and many other dimensions all across these statements. Again, experiences of discrimination and poverty and access to healthcare and so on and so forth. So that's the quick overview. We're working in collaboration with the provincial government and many other partners to make this a reality. We're excited about the level of enthusiasm and momentum that's showing up for us in all of this. So I'm happy to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Danny. We don't have somebody here from Statistics Canada, but the level of detail and also the pace at which your tools are developing for Nova Scotia is really groundbreaking. Let me move on now to the last 5-minute presentation. So 40% of Canada's landmass is in territories, not provinces. And so we have now Ben Horowitz, who's the Director of Communications of the Executive Council Office in the government of Yukon Territory. And he's going to tell us about wellbeing initiatives there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Just so folks know, I don't have a slide deck either, just some initial remarks. So yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this Wellbeing Network and this discussion today. I am speaking with you from up in Canada's far north, Whitehorse, Yukon. Just want to acknowledge that I'm grateful for the opportunity to live and work within the traditional territories of the Kwanlundun First Nation and Ta'an Quechin Council. So like Chris said, I'm the Director of Communications with the Executive Council Office for the Yukon government, and have had this unique opportunity to help advance a well-being indicators framework within the public service. Just talk for a few minutes about where we are today, where we came from, and where we might go next, and certainly hearing from colleagues and other organizations, even in this call today, that where we go next conversation being influenced at the very moment, let's say. So we are on a very similar path as Nova Scotia in that we are working to bring into fruition this vision about the power and potential of well-being indicators, really as a tool for positive change and also as a tool for helping our shared commitments around the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs funding program out of the federal government helped support some of the work we did in Yukon. So just want to acknowledge a generous contribution from them in helping to lead some of the survey work that I'll talk about in a few moments. And just, yeah, more broadly, amazing opportunity to connect with all of you, just coming together and talking about these shared missions of really measuring what matters and using a data-driven approach to improve well-being and just affect change. So for the Yukon government, I will say our focus on well-being indicators began in earnest around 2018. And at that time, a majority government was focused on finding a better mechanism for promoting accountability for results and also for reporting to the public on progress that extends beyond just a narrative format. So typically governments like us, we stand up and we offer really an activities-based summary of all the benefits to society that we're creating from our collective efforts. But there's this pressing question is to what effect? An activities-based reporting approach only goes so far. And so we were looking at various frameworks, and eventually we were drawn to the Canadian Index of Wellbeing and the University of Waterloo. And we were drawn to them because, well, for one, it was uniquely Canadian, a framework that was developed in consultation with Canadians. And two, it offered a statistically rigorous approach for measuring, reporting, and communicating with the public about pressing social, economic, and environmental issues, and most importantly, what government was doing to accelerate progress and influence change. So like I said, we were drawn to the work of Dr. Brian Smale, who I know is on this call, and his team, which at the time were asking these broader national questions. Very simply, how are Canadians doing and how can we be doing better? And at the local level, we really wanted those answers for Yukoners as well. And later in this discussion, when we get into some of the challenges, I will say just data availability in Canada's north, a real barrier to a lot of this work. So that's what led us to, in 2020, certainly a most extraordinary year for obvious reasons, to go out and lead data collection of our own and try to answer those questions. How are Yukoners really doing? And of course, how can we be doing better? So similar to the approach employed by Nova Scotia, we also fielded a community well-being survey, a little bit revised and adapted to the Yukon context, but largely the same. And the response rate was incredible. It was the highest number of responses ever for a broad public engagement style survey of this kind in the territory. And since then, we've released two separate reports. One is a technical report, a summary of all the survey results, and the other is a more high-level profile of well-being that draws on data beyond just that which we collected through the survey. And these two reports, they cater to entirely different audiences, and I will say each are incredibly important. The technical report, the source report from the survey with all the data tables, this is a resource for planners, for policy and program managers, and for those really wanting to use the science in a far more hands-on and operational way. Whereas the profile report, it's written for a more general audience and it's accessible. And the complementary nature of these two reports is really very well aligned with the policy drivers that we have in Yukon, namely our 2016 Yukon Science Strategy, which is all about advancing evidence-based decision-making while ensuring that science in the territory is accessible and understandable for the public. And so for me, the most gratifying part of this work is seeing people and organizations outside of government get excited about the well-being data set that we've created, and producing that data set and sharing it outside of government, really treating that data as a public good unto itself. That was foundational to this project from the early days of its inception. And what we're seeing now is a variety of community organizations, since we released the data set publicly, treating it as a point of departure for new data collection, for leading community interviews, and really drilling down into the issues to help support recommendations and an array of evidence-informed measures really around pandemic recovery at this point. Certainly when this project was getting off the ground, 2018, 2019, even early days 2020, it was obviously never about pandemic response or recovery, but it's certainly morphed into that as time's gone on. And as far as the internal work within government, the aim has always been to align the use of well-being indicators at the intersection of corporate strategic planning and the more regular flow of government decision-making, as well as to treat the indicators as a source for public reporting. And we've made some progress in these areas. I will say there are still many opportunities to continue down this path and more formally operationalize the use of a well-being framework for government of Yukon. Overall, I'd say the work in our strategic planning efforts has been most fruitful, helping to take on that culture shift that Sophie was talking about. Frameworks are important, but the culture shift work is the real challenge and the real opportunity. And so for us, that was about moving government strategic planners away from a focus on activities and outputs and more about outcomes and impact, and helping them get value out of this work we were doing with the Index of Wellbeing. So we have this 2020 data set, and we've really treated it as a tool for helping validate some current strategic priorities, but most exciting for us is the prospect, like Danny was talking to, of another survey and going from point-in-time data to more trending data, and having that ability to compare and evaluate some of the measures, the response efforts since 2020 that have helped the Yukon territory in this area of pandemic recovery. So I'll just stop there. Much more to discuss when we get into the open forum part. But yeah, again, thanks to Chris and colleagues for inviting me here today.
Thank you so much, Ben. I would invite our panelists to keep their cameras on for the rest of our time together, which is actually fairly brief. I'm going to try and take us through as many questions that I have as possible, and maybe work in some others that come up from other audience. My second question is going to relate specifically to Vincent Classen's domain, but I first have a question. Indulge me on this, please, because the title of our webinar today is about approaches in moving beyond GDP. And so I just wonder very quickly if anybody who wants to chime in on this, do we still need to frame this stuff in terms of the culture change, in terms of the selling internally to bureaucracies, and in terms of explaining to the public, do we still need to frame this stuff around a contrast with GDP, or moving beyond GDP, or is and what are the merits or downsides of doing that? Anybody to jump in on that?
I will say, just as a communications director, it still is a very relevant point of departure. That narrative continues to resonate. It's an easy conversation starter. It helps, bring this conversation to a level that most can understand. And I don't see it as an either or. I think it's a both and especially for small jurisdictions like ours, we know that GDP does not reflect quality of life in any way. We're so vulnerable to shocks in the mining industry and just pushing GDP around. So I would offer that. For us, it's both.
I will say yes. Oh, sorry, there's a hand. I couldn't find the hand. I just jumped in there. Sorry.
Go ahead, Vincent.
I would say say it is a very useful marker. I mean, GDP is a relatively, in great historical terms, a newish concept, but it's still what we see in the papers, and we still see, well, GDP is down, the projections are this. We don't talk about well-being as much. Well-being projections are down, well-being is up or down. We all think it's important, but it's still not something that we measure as much on a daily basis or an annual basis, even though we should be going that way. Even if we are going that way, the fact is GDP is still a very useful marker for us to measure from. And I think it's sort of a departure point for a lot of our work.
The only point that I would make is just to avoid the binary perspectives that could be attached to this, and understand that economic questions are important. We have privileged the GDP growth and assumed that it's a proxy for all success for all members of society. And that's, obviously not so. And it's reflected in research that I didn't put a slide on in terms of how Nova Scotians see this. They have a balanced perspective about what that looks like, but they, from our perspective, including the business community, don't see it as opposite sides of something, but two sides of the same coin.
Stephanie?
I think just building off of Vincent and Danny's comments, I would say that because GDP is the departure point in speaking to how some of the well-being movement came about, it was in reaction to GDP as kind of our defining yardstick of progress. You can't help but start the conversation there. If we are interested in evidence-based decision-making, it's hard to compete with the how established, I suppose, the metrics are in the macroeconomic realm. We don't have agreed upon well-being evidence-based. The difference of well-being frameworks and indicators are a factor in the discussions of skeptics of how it is that well-being can't be operationalized, can't be implemented. They are on some level a distraction, though we don't have to land on the framework necessarily. But I think I would just say, I think from our perspective, beyond GDP, it's not that GDP be replaced. National income is important. It pays the bills and allows growing standards of living. But to bring in other indicators that are obviously based on the growing literature contributors to well-being. And then you can start to see how it is that certain decisions just require trade-offs. So growth in the very short run could be at the expense of actually growth in the long run, and in the medium run, perhaps at the expense of things like environmental stewardship or social cohesion and confidence in institutions. And in general, people would not disagree that those are things that actually contribute to a society that we want to live in, and better quality of life.
Sophie, did you want to add something?
Thanks. There? Yeah. I mean, I think GDP is as the main measure is a construct of, economists of old, policymakers and the media. I think if you asked the average person on the street, GDP probably wouldn't be the thing that matters to the most. And in fact, certainly from a UK perspective, polling, tells us that the things that matter the most to people are health, education, and increasingly the climate emergency, and some of the kind of values, and there might be different definitions that people hold, but some of the values that people kind of come together around are values of fairness. And we know that a focus purely on GDP does not result in that fairness. And there's a live debate in the UK at the moment with a new Prime Minister and new Chancellor having that new economic policy, which is even more focused on growth and tax breaks. And there's a big live debate going on around GDP in the main, or a focus on that sort of economic growth, does not result in kind of trickle down benefits to everyone. In fact, absolutely the reverse. It results in trickle up, making the rich richer and not doing anything to address the challenges and the well-being of those on lower incomes. I think there's also something here from a future generations perspective, because increasingly we're seeing our Gen Zs and our Generation Alphas who will be coming behind them asking for different things. So they are choosing who they go to work for on the basis of not just what their salary is going to be, but actually what is the life work balance in that organization. They're choosing who they go to work for on the basis of the values of those organizations and whether they fit with their own values. And I think it's going to become an actual political, big P political reality and a small p political reality for governments, politicians, and indeed businesses and employers, that they are going to have to move towards meeting what the next generation see as those sets of values. And beyond that, the political realities are also that if we focus purely on GDP unfettered, actually, without operating within those kind of planetary boundaries, actually prosperity is going to be falling. And already, in live issue again this week in Canada, I don't know the amount of money that you'll be spending as a result of dealing with the fallout of cyclone or storm Fiona, but increasingly those sorts of events are going to be happening and will have a direct impact on GDP. So I think whether we like it or not, or whether there are those people who are still really stuck in the GDP world as being the most important metrics, I think the world is moving around them, and actually I think that those who will be successful and those who will be sustainable in the future are going to have to get with a new economic program.
Thank you. I see Vincent has his hand up, but maybe you can lead us off on our next question. We've heard a lot about data and measurement from Ben and Danny. I want to talk something about the conceptual understandings of well-being. So we have here Sophie. Legislation that I guess gave rise to Sophie's position is about the well-being of future generations, and so I want to talk about this this relationship between sustainability and well-being just a little bit. And as much as I'm going to try and be brief in posing the question, let's try and be brief in our answers as well. So I've always thought there's a tension. There's a traditional tension between either the economy and the environment, or in the well-being context between meeting the environmental imperatives and most framings of well-being, right? Environmental imperatives come as constraints, and they come as a trade-off between now and the future. And so I've advocated a lot for separating these conceptually in the way that we frame these things, by thinking about limits in order to get at sustainability, and then well-being as something that we can think positively and constructively about within limits. So what are the respective advantages of different ways of combining well-being and sustainability within an overarching policy framework?
I'm happy to pick up on that if no one else wants to come in first. I'm sorry, I can't, there's something wrong with my computer. I can't see anyone, so.
Yeah, please lead us off.
Sorry. So, I mean, my feeling is that in many cases they are one and the same thing. I'm quite attracted by Kate Raworth's donut economics, which I think speaks to what you were describing there, Chris, which is, if we think of a ring donut, we must operate within the donuts. We must not go beyond planetary boundaries, and we must protect well-being so that people aren't falling through the middle. If you haven't read that book, I would highly recommend it. So I can see, that kind of concept of boundaries, is a useful one. However, I think the realities of getting people on board talk more to bringing those two approaches together. So in the example that I gave in my presentation of the road and how we sort of cancelled the road, if I had gone in, the primary sort of arguments there were economy versus environment, traditional, sets of arguments. Usually in road building schemes, economy certainly trumps environment. Actually, it was some of the other arguments that were put there, particularly around addressing inequality, health, and wider well-being, that were the arguments that were more persuasive to those who perhaps wouldn't have got involved in a kind of economy versus environment debate. And so I think that, in order to not have the kind of, sustainability, which is predominantly seen as environmental sustainability, I think to both the average member of the public and indeed to a lot of policymakers over here, and well-being kind of over there, I think that where you hit the sweet spot is where you can combine those two things, and you can show that by doing things in a sustainable way, you're also helping to secure well-being benefits for your population. So I would advocate the two coming together. And I think certainly from our perspective in Wales, the fact that we have brought into our Act, the environmental NGOs see it as their Act, the public health institutions and workers see it as a public health Act. The fact that we've brought culture, arts, heritage in, we're in Canada at the moment with some colleagues from Wales Arts International who are very much seeing it as their Act. And I think the more you can bring those things together, the more you can build a movement around change, and the more you can get people pulling together under that kind of common framework, rather than having this sort of complexity around who's responsible for what and multiple reporting frameworks.
Vince, I want to give you a chance to come in next, and then Danny and Stephanie.
Thank you. I note the comment about multiple frameworks, and I think that's something we experience in Canada, and I think probably elsewhere as well. And that's because this is a time of innovation and experimentation, and things are moving very fast. But on well-being, I think well-being is, and what I'm hearing is very exciting. What's happening in Wales, what's happening in Nova Scotia or Yukon or across Canada and everywhere, is the fact that these norms are changing of what is important to measure, what matters. And when we say, GDP is a reference point, I don't think any of us think that it's the only thing or it's even the most important thing. But the fact is, there's sort of a long history of sort of measurement tools around GDP or financial capital, for example, that we now have to think very carefully of how we apply to natural capital and to human capital. And I think that's the challenge that we're at. I think when I look at our Act, we're responsible at Environment Canada for the Federal Sustainable Development Act. 2008, that was adopted in order to force the government to set targets and report on progress on environmental sustainability. And the interesting thing is, in 2020, that changed, as many of you might know, to go beyond the environment, because even the environment is not enough as a check on the economy. In fact, there's a whole other social dimension that we have to understand, measure, set targets, and we're moving into this space. And sometimes it's very complex. I did know that I think we all experience the challenge of bureaucracy, which is of course important because it's how we organize our work, but which is also very challenging because we are the federal side. We're 100 organizations that are now contributing to the federal sustainable development strategy. So on well-being is where we want to go. I've heard so many examples of how we have very exciting data. It was quite compelling what you showed us in Nova Scotia. But we're all trying to do this, and we have to do it at different levels. We're going to do it at the federal level. Stephanie and colleagues are doing it with quality of life. We also have environmental indicators that feed into that framework. And this is all pretty complex. But the fact is, we do want to move into the well-being space because it is a logical evolution of what we want to measure in terms of what matters to people. Because it's no longer what we just what we produce, and it's no longer just about how the production impacts the environment and if there's enough resources, which was the debate probably 20 years ago. It's about how we measure how people are interacting with these factors and what it really means for for quality of life and for our lives as human beings. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Danny. You look muted still.
Thanks. I'm just going to pick on up on the complex nature of what Vincent was just pointing to, and just point to this field in general being an area that I think perhaps invites us more and more into the whole notion of systems change and complexity itself, and that well-being is a multidimensional notion, and it's going to be hard to capture in the ways in which we've imagined how things are working, both intersectionally as different topic areas and variables and sectors, but you're bringing into the larger vision piece about sustainability. And we know that, for example, in addition to the 5 domains that the Federal Quality of Life Framework applies, it overlays this notion of sustainability, and then it's got inclusion and fairness. I think that's an advancement that doesn't exist in most of the other frameworks, and it gives Canada an opportunity to sort of see this at a level that marries up the many layers of that. But then when you take from places like Wales, where you're seeing the intersectional nature of this, it gives us a richer feel for, okay, now we're going to be able to really get to the heart of the pain points by using all of these resources and new knowledge about how to crack the code and make life a little bit better for especially those who have been falling behind. And lots to say about the degree to which our society has been moving in a direction that has really not worked for underrepresented and marginalized communities. And this works hopefully intensively to close gaps for them.
I just noticed Ben's hand up. I don't know if that was new, if that was there earlier. Stephanie, do you want to go next, and then Ben can wrap us up as quickly as possible, and we'll get it to a couple more questions before we have to close.
Sure, I will try to be succinct and say that there could be, I am sure there are different views even within the federal government, but from where I'm standing, it is out of necessity that the work on well-being be joined up with the work of sustainable development. Whether or not it is in one framework, it sort of depends on what you mean, in that the quality of life framework that we are dealing with in some form, we hope will survive the ages, but it is meant to be evergreen because Canadians should see themselves in it. And as the definitions of these change, we hope that the framework would as well. Because of path dependency, how governments are organized, because of how the file comes about, I see a dynamic where there is this top-down work joining up with the bottom-up. As a result, this one framework that joins these areas it's likely to look different across jurisdictions. But I think the fundamental thing is we're looking at there's a growing consensus about what quality of life looks like, and there's this time dimension. We are interested that it be across all Canadians, and to get there with one framework or not, however it is operationalized, it will involve government working internally differently, and with stakeholders differently, requiring horizontal collaboration that perhaps makes us uneasy because it's on a scale that we're not used to. And at the same time, there needs to be consideration for how the end goals cross different jurisdictions of sovereignty. They cross mandates and responsibilities and accountabilities, and adjusting to that environment will be a challenge and involve some culture change. Sorry, that was not as succinct as I expected.
Thanks. Ben?
Yeah, just real quick, I will say for us in the Yukon, it was impossible to separate our well-being work from the sustainability framework, and particularly just us wanting to contribute to those national goals and advancing progress on the SDGs. And so what we did on our 2 reports was include links to all of the SDGs across various local indicators we developed flowing from the Community Wellbeing Survey And this was work that was originally led by University of Waterloo in their mapping exercise, drawing those connections between the community well-being survey sections and questions and that which are contained as goals in the overall Canadian commitment to advancing the SDGs. So you'll see those icons of all the SDGs kind of scattered about our report. And again, it was impossible for us to separate the two, and that's the approach we took.
Thank you. I'm going to, maybe at the end or last one, I'm going to ask everybody for the top 3 challenges that they're facing. So I'm just letting you know that so that you can think about having those on the tip of your tongue. And I have a question or 2 now directed more at Sophie, and then we can maybe respond with the Canadian context in mind. So this is going to sound like 3 questions. I hope you can make it sort of one answer, Sophie, but can you tell us more about the importance of your role of having a commissioner, as a single person? And so a related question is, are you a household name in Wales? You've given us a lot of relatively concrete evidence for real outcomes and accountability for what's already happened, which has been remarkable to me. And you've touched on this a little bit, but I wonder to what extent actually the right way to ask this is, what are the limits of your power? So I wanted to ask, have you had to exert power? I think you mentioned constructive challenges, but what does that look like? So, overall picture coming from a Canadian point of view is, how important is it to have sort of a figurehead for this change? And just tell us a little bit more about that, how that works in Wales.
Okay, so I guess the question is, are people talking about the Future Generations Act and myself as the Commissioner in the pub? No, they're probably not. There's an increasing recognition, I would say, in the kind of interested masses in terms of the Future Generations Act itself and the role of Commissioner, and we can tell that by the number of bodies who are not covered by the Future Generations Act, contacting us to get on board with, wanting to voluntarily apply the act. So businesses, the third sector, and various others. I suppose that personally, my sort of profile is increasing, I suppose, over the 7 years of my term. So I do quite a lot of media appearances and so on, but inevitably it's kind of when there are big issues such as the M4 or big challenges, for example, to the government around the climate emergency and so on, where that profile increases. In terms of evidence of accountability, how important is the role of Commissioner? Well, I guess it's that kind of someone who has got a statutory position and statutory powers to be the kind of conscience for future generations, if you like, and someone who has the ability to call out on behalf of future generations and put a different perspective. So the perspective that my role brings is quite different, I think, to perspectives that we might get from other institutions or NGOs. Number one, because it's very holistic, and number two, because it's very much focused on future generations who don't have a voice. In terms of the kind of limits of my powers, so the Act hasn't been properly tested in the courts, and it doesn't confer individual rights on people. So an ordinary person couldn't sort of sue the government on the basis that the interests of their future interests have been compromised or so on. The route would be through judicial review. And we all know that that's a very complex process, and usually just requires the decision to go back to the drawing board and the process to be followed properly. So I would say that it's not the kind of very specific legal powers that are within the legislation which is the powerful thing. It's the softer power that the legislation, I suppose, confers on the Commissioner, and the way in which the Commissioner exercises those powers. and the way I would say critically that we focused on building a movement around this and getting lots of other institutions on board with this vision for Wales that the Future Generations Act sets out. So in Wales, what we're now seeing is that those organisations are almost doing my job for me, in that they are using the framework of the Act to challenge back to government and other public institutions, and also to sort of frame their own work. So I would say that's the power of the Commissioner. It doesn't necessarily have to be a commissioner, it could be a commission, it could be, you know, a range of different things. But I would say that the most critical thing is that, yes, it's about sort of monitoring progress and metrics and so on, but it also needs to have this, I suppose, you know, some sort of figurehead speaking out and advocate for future generations role as well.
Thank you. We are seconds away. In fact, it's past. I'm going to take I don't know for prerogative I have to do this. I want to just throw one more thing out, and then we can just go around and each give a quick answer, and you can add on what the top 3 challenges are. But if you have a sentence to say on this question, as well as those, how do you know, there's this risk when there's a new framework and new initiative that it ends up being labeling and box ticking and drawing you know, lines between things conceptually. How do you know, or how in the direction that you are going in your respective efforts, you know, how will you know when the Wellbeing framework is actually changing what resources get allocated? It's actually changing decisions that get made. And then also, what are the top 3 challenges you're facing in as short and bullet point of form as you can, and then we will close. Anyone?
I'll jump in very quickly.
Yes.
So I think if we are measuring the right things, then we should know if we're having an impact. If we actually are doing a good job at identifying the things that matter, and we were able to measure the things that matter, I think that over time, we should be able to measure our performance. That's certainly what's behind a lot of these frameworks. It's what's behind our act. And I think that and also the reviews of our Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, the Auditor General, keeps us honest. I think that is a measure of our success. In terms of the challenges, I think we have to embrace this expectation to go further. And I think we have to overcome, certainly in the federal system, and I think in governments in general, overcome silo thinking and think in a more integrated way, but always with a mind to what is meaningful to measure and have as targets.
Yes, Stephanie.
Hopefully this is short, because I will echo some of what Vincent has said. Yes, with respect to the Canadian Quality of Life Framework, there are indicators, so we should be able to see when we're moving the needle. The caveat then is that it's supposed to be a comprehensive picture of quality of life, and the federal government doesn't have all the levers. So it is also that quality of life is at a certain level, a society level, where maybe all the levers are not directly impacting. It's maybe a couple of degrees from that, so that adds a level of complexity. In terms of 3 challenges, I will repeat Vincent here actually and say that one key thing is working together in this area of what are shared responsibilities for outcomes that we all have an interest in. The current machinery might not support that. Maybe another is the quality of life data and evidence base, building the stakeholder base. For that will take time. And then finally, maybe from the federal government perspective, I appreciated Danny's shout out about the framework and the cross-cutting lenses. On some level, the framework, if it comes to fruition in the way that we would like, will demand different kinds of thinking and analysis, the asking of different questions, and the skills and capacity of the public servers would have to rise to the occasion.
Thank you, Danny, and then Ben.
I'm going to skip your first question to save you time and take it up to sort of just a shout out. And you know who you are. There are a number of people who are on the call participating still who've been pioneers in this area. And so just a shout out with all of them, the Brians, the Carries, and others who've been part of this. But I'll point to two challenges that I think are pretty universal in the conversations that I've had and are special for a Canadian context. And that is that having the inclusion of, in all the ways that this would matter, of underrepresented and marginalized communities represents a real challenge in all of this. And that is particularly so for Indigenous Canadians on Turtle Island whose worldview wouldn't reflect a lot of the literature that has been produced and considered in all of this up until now. That's the biggest challenge we have, and generally, you know, Black and African Nova Scotian communities and others for whom the system has really been hosing them is I don't trust and see this as working. And the only thing other than that is the risk of whiplashing back to the old way of thinking and doing, because the systems, the culture, and the assumptions that we hold within all of society and the organizations just go to default. And that's going to be a difficult thing as we move to another stage of the pandemic that is going to be hard to bring people back from as they fear about the future even more.
Thank you. Ben.
Yeah, Chris, to your first question about when will we be making budget or allocation decisions driven by a well-being, framework or set of considerations. And I think the answer to that for public sector is not until we move to performance-based or outcomes-based budgeting and surmount these current approaches, which are activities-based and outputs-based kind of by necessity. And I will say at the Executive Council office, where our bread and butter, our core business is decision-making support for Premier and cabinets. And for me, outside of the main budget cycle, the real opportunity is to help those decision makers look through a well-being lens when they consider all proposals before government. And we have a real ability to revise templates, revise decision-making tools to focus on those priorities. We've done it for GITA, gender inclusivity and diversity analysis. We've done it for climate change, and we can certainly do it for a broad well-being approach. And that's a personal goal of mine in the coming months.
Thanks. Sophie?
Thanks. In terms of budget, well, we are seeing that shift in Wales. I scrutinise the budget every year in terms of how the government is allocating its resources in line with its wellbeing objectives, and that's, for example, one of the reasons why we've seen that shift in terms of infrastructure spend, but also some significant shift on spending towards climate, on spending towards early intervention and prevention in health and social care, and in the early years, and on tackling poverty, for example. So that is happening in Wales, not perfectly, but it is happening. Just in terms of the kind of three challenges, I think it's nailing your frameworks, but then realising that your job is not complete, and we've got to go beyond frameworks towards cultural change, and that cultural change requires some really progressive leadership. Across the board, it requires us to focus on every part of the system, from the top down and the bottom up. And until we do that, then I think that we won't have fully embedded this sort of shift to well-being policies and well-being, measuring well-being rather than just maintaining the status quo.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, everyone, well, first of all, bearing with my abuse of the clock. It's actually not my habit. I hope this is the beginning of a relationship between Wales and Canada on this file, and that before Sophie's mandate ends in about 6 months, we can get together for more advice for the efforts of our panelists here, but also many in the audience, as well as the Canadian Wellbeing Knowledge Network on this topic. Thank you to everybody for coming. Stay tuned for more webinars from the CWKN.